The gunshots echoed across the suburban neighborhood as the rescue helicopter circled overhead, searching for a missing child. But Margaret Whitmore wasn't trying to help. She was trying to bring it down. The manicured lawns of Willowbrook Estates had always been Margaret Whitmore's domain. For 8 years, she'd ruled the Homeowners Association with an iron fist, measuring grass heights with a ruler and issuing violations for mailboxes that dared to be the wrong shade of beige. At 62, with silver hair pulled into a perpetual bun and reading glasses that seemed permanently perched in judgment, Margaret believed order was everything. Chaos was the enemy, and she was its sworn destroyer. But on that sweltering August afternoon, chaos would find her anyway. Dr. Sarah Chen had moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months earlier, seeking the kind of quiet suburban life that would balance her demanding work as an emergency room physician. The corner lot at 1247 Maple Drive seemed perfect, spacious enough for her teenage daughter Emma's friends to visit, with a backyard that backed up to the county's nature preserve. What Sarah hadn't anticipated was living next door to Margaret Whitmore. The first violation notice arrived within a week. Sarah's mailbox was inconsistent with community standards. Apparently, black wasn't an approved color. Then came complaints about her car being parked improperly in her own driveway, followed by citations for having outdoor furniture that wasn't pre-approved by the architectural committee. Margaret's latest crusade involved Sarah's small vegetable garden, which she claimed violated the landscaping covenant. "This is harassment," Sarah told her neighbor, Jenna Riverside, as they stood in Sarah's driveway examining the latest violation notice. "I'm a doctor. I save lives for a living. And this woman is worried about my tomato plants." Jenna shook her head sympathetically. "Margaret's gotten worse since her husband died. The HOA presidency is all she has left." What neither woman knew was that Margaret had been conducting her own surveillance operation. From her kitchen window, she meticulously documented every infraction with time-stamped photographs. Her manila folders grew thick with evidence of non-compliance, and she'd begun researching legal precedents for forcing non-conforming residents to sell their homes. The breaking point came on August 15th, during the search for 7-year-old Tommy Martinez. Tommy had wandered away from a family picnic in the nature preserve, and as darkness fell, the county had deployed every available resource. Search and rescue teams combed the dense woods, while a county sheriff's helicopter equipped with thermal imaging circled overhead, its powerful searchlight cutting through the gathering dusk. Dr. Chen had volunteered immediately, using her medical training to assist the ground search teams. Her backyard, which bordered the preserve, had become an impromptu staging area for the search operation. Emergency vehicles lined the street, their red and blue lights painting the twilight in urgent colors. Margaret watched from her window, her jaw clenched in fury. The helicopters were loud. The searchlights were disturbing her evening routine. Worst of all, people were trampling across lawns, ignoring property lines, treating her perfectly ordered neighborhood like some kind of wilderness. At 9:37 p.m., the helicopter made another low pass over the preserve, its thermal camera scanning for any sign of the missing child. The aircraft's path took it directly over Margaret's property, and something inside her snapped. She retrieved her late husband's .38 revolver from the bedroom safe, standing in her backyard. Margaret raised the weapon toward the circling aircraft. The helicopter's searchlight swept across her property, and in that moment of blazing illumination, she pulled the trigger, once, twice, 3 times. The bullets spark off the helicopter's metal hull, one shattering a side window. The pilot, veteran flight officer Marcus Rodriguez, immediately radioed the emergency. "We're taking fire. We're taking fire. Ground units. We have an active shooter in the residential area." Within minutes, the search for Tommy Martinez had become a manhunt for an attempted murder. Dr. Chen watched in horror from the preserve as police cruisers surrounded Margaret's house, their sirens wailing. Federal agents from the ATF arrived next. Firing on aircraft was a federal crime, and Margaret Whitmore had just committed an act of domestic terrorism. "Ma'am, put down the weapon and come out with your hands visible," the SWAT commander's voice boomed through the megaphone. Margaret stood in her doorway, still clutching the revolver, her face a mask of righteous indignation. "This is my property. I have rights." That helicopter was violating noise ordinances. The absurdity of her justification hung in the air like smoke from her gun barrel. As federal agents handcuffed Margaret Whitmore in her own driveway, Dr. Chen realized that her 6 months of harassment had been building to this moment. The violation notices, the surveillance, the escalating attempts to force her from the neighborhood. It had all been preparation for something much darker. But what Sarah didn't know yet was that Margaret's actions weren't born from simple HOA tyranny. Hidden in that manila folder system was evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond petty neighborhood disputes. Margaret Whitmore had been planning something much more sinister than anyone could have imagined, and the helicopter incident was just the beginning. The real question wasn't why Margaret had fired at a rescue helicopter. The question was what she'd been trying to hide. 3 days after Margaret Whitmore's arrest, Dr. Sarah Chen discovered the first camera. She'd been watering her disputed tomato plants when sunlight glinted off something metallic tucked behind the fence. Slats, the tiny surveillance device was professionally mounted and angled directly at her kitchen window. Sarah's hands trembled as she found the second camera, then the third. 7 cameras in total, all focused on her property, all installed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "This changes everything," said Detective Ray Castellanos, photographing the surveillance equipment. A 20-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, Castellanos had seen his share of neighbor disputes. But nothing like this. This isn't HOA enforcement. This is stalking. Margaret's federal arraignment had been swift and brutal. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a former Air Force JAG officer who specialized in aviation crimes, wasn't interested in plea negotiations. Mrs. Whitmore endangered the lives of everyone on that aircraft. Walsh told reporters on the courthouse steps she interfered with a rescue operation for a missing child. "We will prosecute this case to the fullest extent of federal law." But Margaret's defense attorney, David Kim, saw opportunities in the chaos. Kim had built his reputation defending seemingly hopeless cases, finding the human story beneath the headlines. At 65, with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that could shift from grandfatherly warmth to courtroom thunder. He knew that juries didn't convict people they understood. Margaret is a widow who dedicated her life to preserving her community. Kim told the press she made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. But she's not a terrorist. She's a grieving woman who lost control. Behind the scenes, Kim was building a different strategy entirely. The surveillance cameras bothered him. Margaret had insisted she'd installed them for community security. But Kim's private investigator, former FBI agent Lisa Chang, had discovered something more troubling. These are amateur installations, Chang reported, spreading photographs across Kim's conference table, professional-grade equipment, military mounting systems. Someone taught her how to do this, or someone did it for her. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen was fighting her own battle. The story had exploded across social media, with hashtag HOA Karen trending nationwide. But the attention brought unwanted scrutiny of her own life. Anonymous online accounts began posting her home address, her work schedule, even photos of her teenage daughter Emma. Someone had hacked her social media accounts, changing her privacy settings to make everything public. Mom, people at school are saying you're the reason that woman went crazy, Emma told her one evening, tears streaming down her face. They're saying if you hadn't moved here, none of this would have happened. Sarah held her daughter close, rage building in her chest. This wasn't just about property violations anymore. Someone was systematically trying to destroy her life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jenna Riverside, the sympathetic neighbor who'd witnessed months of Margaret's harassment, approached Sarah with a manila envelope. I found this in my mailbox this morning, Jonna said, her voice shaking. I think you need to see it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, pictures of Sarah leaving for work, Emma walking to school, Sarah's car in various parking lots round town. But these weren't taken with surveillance cameras. These were shot with a telephoto lens from a distance by someone following her. The timestamps went back 8 months. 2 months before Sarah had even moved to Willowbrook Estates. Someone was watching me before I bought the house, Sarah whispered, the implications crashing over her like ice water. Detective Castellanos expedited the investigation. Phone records revealed that Margaret had been in contact with someone called the coordinator. Dozens of calls and text messages using an encrypted messaging app. The FBI's digital forensics team was working to crack the encryption, but it would take time. More disturbing was what they found in Margaret's house. The basement had been converted into a surveillance center, with multiple monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the neighborhood. But it wasn't just Sarah being watched. Margaret had been spying on at least 12 different households, documenting routines, visitors, and what appeared to be personal weaknesses. A wall map marked with red pins showed a pattern that made Agent Walsh's blood run cold. Every marked house belonged to a minority family or single woman. Margaret hadn't been enforcing HOA rules. She'd been conducting intelligence gathering for something much more organized. This is domestic terrorism with a racial component, Walsh told her team. We're looking at a hate crime conspiracy. But David Kim wasn't giving up on his client. In a private meeting at the county jail, He confronted Margaret directly. "Margaret, I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth. Someone else is involved in this. Who is the coordinator?" Margaret's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the man who was trying to save her from life in federal prison. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I tell you, they'll kill me. They said they'd kill me if I ever talked." "Who?" "Margaret." "Who said that?" She looked around the interview room. Paranoid and broken. They said the neighborhood needed to be purified. They said people like Dr. Chen were destroying America. They gave me the cameras, the training, the targets. Kim leaned forward. "Margaret, were you part of an organized group?" Her nod was barely perceptible. "They called it the Heritage Foundation. But that's not their real name. Their real name is something else. Something that would terrify you." As Kim left the jail that evening, he knew the helicopter shooting was just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret Whitmore wasn't just a racist HOA president gone rogue. She was a foot soldier in a larger war. And Dr. Sarah Chen had been selected as a target for reasons that went far beyond property violations. The question now wasn't just who was behind the conspiracy. The question was how many other Margaret Whitmores were out there, waiting for their orders to strike. The federal courthouse in downtown was ringed with protesters as Margaret Whitmore's trial began on a crisp October morning. On one side, anti-government militia supporters held signs reading "HOA rights are property rights." On the other, civil rights activists demanded justice for what they called domestic terrorism with a racist agenda. Inside courtroom 7B, U.S. Attorney Jennifer Wells stood before 12 jurors and delivered an opening statement that would make national news. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about an HOA dispute gone wrong. This is about a coordinated campaign of intimidation, surveillance, and ultimately violence, designed to terrorize minority families into leaving a suburban neighborhood." Defense attorney David Kim countered with a different narrative. "Margaret Whitmore is a 72-year-old widow who made a terrible mistake under extreme stress. She is not a terrorist. She is a victim herself, manipulated by people who used her grief and isolation for their own sinister purposes." What neither attorney knew was that Dr. Sarah Chen had spent the previous 3 months conducting her own investigation, and she was sitting in the gallery with evidence that would blow the case wide open. The prosecution's case began systematically. Agent Lisa Morrison from the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit testified about the surveillance equipment found in Margaret's home. The cameras were military-grade, Morrison explained to the jury. They required specialized training to install and operate. Mrs. Whitmore had detailed dossiers on 12 households, including work schedules, family routines, and personal vulnerabilities. Walsh projected photographs of Margaret's basement surveillance center onto the courtroom screens. Gasps echoed through the gallery as jurors saw the wall map with red pins marking minority-owned homes and single-parent households. This wasn't random harassment, Walsh continued. This was systematic targeting based on race and perceived vulnerability. But Kim's cross-examination revealed cracks in the federal case. Agent Morrison, you testified that this equipment required specialized training. Where did Mrs. Whitmore receive this training? We We haven't definitively established that yet, and the encrypted communications with this mysterious coordinator. Have you identified this person? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. The investigation is ongoing. Kim pressed harder. So my client, a 72-year-old woman with no military or surveillance background, somehow acquired professional spy equipment, learned to use it expertly, and organized a neighborhood terrorism campaign all by herself. That's not what I said. Then who helped her? Agent Morrison, who is really on trial here. The turning point came on day 3, when Dr. Sarah Chen took the witness stand. Walsh had planned to use Sarah's testimony to show the impact of Margaret's harassment, but Sarah had other plans. She'd coordinated with Detective Castellanos to time her revelation perfectly. Dr. Chen, can you describe the effect of Mrs. Whitmore's actions on your family? Sarah looked directly at the jury. Mrs. Whitmore's actions were terrifying, but they weren't the real crime. The real crime was what I discovered 3 weeks ago. Walsh froze. This wasn't in her witness preparation, Your Honor. Kim objected. This is outside the scope of direct examination. But Judge Patricia Harrison was intrigued. I'll allow it. Dr. Chen, please continue. Sarah reached into her purse and produced a small recording device. 3 weeks ago, I received a phone call from someone claiming to be the coordinator. They didn't know I was recording. The courtroom erupted. Walsh demanded a sidebar. But Judge Harrison was already ruling. Dr. Chen, you may play the recording. For the jury, the voice that filled the courtroom was calm, educated, and chillingly casual. Dr. Chen, Margaret served her purpose, but she became unstable. We want you to know that our organization holds no ill will toward you personally. You were simply selected as a test case. A test case for what? Sarah's voice on the recording was steady despite the circumstances. To see how effectively we could drive an undesirable resident from a target neighborhood using psychological pressure and community enforcement. Margaret was our instrument, but you were never the real objective. Sarah paused the recording. There's more. The voice continued. Our real objective was to document the process, refine our techniques, and scale the operation nationally. We have associates in 37 states now, all using similar methods to curate their communities. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Margaret Whitmore looked shocked. Your Honor, Walsh stood quickly. We need to authenticate this recording and... Judge Harrison held up her hand. Dr. Chen, do you have more evidence? Sarah nodded. The caller identified himself as Robert Hartwell, regional coordinator for something called the American Heritage Preservation Network. I've spent 3 months tracking him down. She looked directly at the prosecution table. He's in this courtroom right now. Every head turned as Sarah pointed toward the gallery. A well-dressed man in his 50s, who'd been attending the trial as an apparent journalist, was already moving toward the exit. That's him. That's Robert Hartwell. U.S. Marshals blocked the courtroom doors as chaos erupted. The man Sarah had identified was indeed Robert Hartwell, a former military intelligence officer who'd been operating domestic terrorism cells across the country under the cover of a legitimate-sounding heritage organization. As Hartwell was handcuffed, Margaret Whitmore finally spoke, her voice breaking. He said, I was protecting my neighborhood. He said Dr. Chen was part of an invasion. He said if I didn't help, that hurt me too. David Kim saw his opening. Your Honor, I move for a mistrial. My client was clearly acting under duress as part of a larger conspiracy. But U.S. Attorney Walsh had regained her composure. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to evaluate this new evidence and consider additional charges. Judge Harrison gavelled for order. Court will recess until tomorrow morning. Mr. Hartwell will be held pending federal charges. As the courtroom cleared, Margaret Whitmore sat in the defendant's chair, finally understanding that she'd been a pawn in a game much larger and more sinister than she'd ever imagined. But the biggest revelations were yet to come. The trial that had started as a simple case of an HOA president gone rogue was about to expose a nationwide network of domestic terrorists, operating in plain sight, using neighborhood associations as cover for systematic racial intimidation. And Robert Hartwell was just the beginning. Judge Patricia Harrison had seen many things in 30 years on the federal bench, but nothing had prepared her for the revelation that would emerge on the final day of Margaret Whitmore's trial. After a weekend recess, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. News crews from every major network had descended on the courthouse, and FBI agents in dark suits lined the walls. What had started as a local horror dispute had become a window into something much more frightening. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood before the jury with documents that had arrived via encrypted transmission. Just hours earlier, ladies and gentlemen, new evidence has come to light that fundamentally changes this case. The defendant, Margaret Whitmore, was not acting alone, nor was she acting as part of a small regional conspiracy. She was part of a nationwide domestic terrorism network with connections to federal agencies. The bombshell landed like a physical blow. Even defense attorney David Kim looked stunned. Your Honor, Kim objected. This is highly prejudicial and, Mr. Kim, Judge Harrison interrupted. I suggest you hear what the government has to say before making objections, Walsh continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Robert Hartwell, the man identified by Dr. Chen and arrested in this courtroom, was not just a regional coordinator. He was a current employee of the Department of Homeland Security, operating under official cover to infiltrate and monitor domestic extremist groups. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret Whitmore gripped her attorney's arm, her face pale with confusion and terror. However, Walsh raised her voice over the commotion. Agent Hartwell went rogue. Instead of simply monitoring these groups, he began organizing them. He used his federal resources and training to create a nationwide network of neighborhood-level operatives, using HOA enforcement as a cover for systematic racial intimidation. Dr. Sarah Chen, watching from the gallery, felt her world shift. The harassment she'd experienced hadn't been random racism or even organized bigotry. It had been a federal operation gone wrong. David Kim stood slowly, his mind racing through the implications. Your Honor, if Mrs. Whitmore was manipulated by a federal agent operating under official authority, then she was acting under color of federal law. This changes everything about her culpability. But Walsh wasn't finished. There's more. Your Honor, Agent Hartwell's operation, which he called Project Purity, had successfully infiltrated HOA boards in over 200 communities across the United States. They were systematically documenting and harassing minority residents, creating detailed databases of what they called displacement targets. She clicked a remote, and the courtroom screens filled with a map of the United States, dotted with red pins representing communities where the network had been active. Each pin represents a community where residents had been systematically harassed, surveilled, and intimidated into leaving their homes. The pattern is identical to what happened in Willowbrook Estates, and in every case, the harassment was coordinated by compromised HOA officials working with Hartwell's network. Margaret Whitmore Funnel Lie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was helping my community. He showed me federal credentials. He said it was a government program to maintain neighborhood stability. The jury shifted uncomfortably as the full scope of the deception became clear. Judge Harrison called for order as Kim stood to address the court. Your Honor, my client was clearly the victim of an elaborate federal deception. She was manipulated by a rogue government agent into believing her actions were patriotic and legal. But the final twist was yet to come. Dr. Sarah Chen stood up in the gallery requesting permission to address the court. Judge Harrison, recognizing the unusual nature of the entire proceeding, allowed it. Your Honor, there's something else the court needs to know. I wasn't randomly selected as a target. Sarah walked to the witness stand, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of what she was about to reveal. 3 months ago, I discovered why Agent Hartwell's network specifically chose me. My father, Dr. James Chen, was a federal whistleblower who exposed illegal surveillance programs in the 1990s. Agent Hartwell's network didn't just target me because I was a minority moving into a white, suburban neighborhood. They targeted me because of my family's history of opposing federal overreach. The courtroom fell silent as the full picture emerged. This hadn't been random racism or even systematic neighborhood terrorism. It had been personal revenge, carried out by a rogue federal agent using government resources to settle old scores while building a nationwide network of domestic operatives. Project Purity wasn't just about racial intimidation, Sarah continued. It was about identifying and neutralizing families with histories of opposing federal authority. My father's whistleblowing got him killed in what was ruled a car accident. Agent Hartwell made sure I knew that when he called me U.S. Attorney, Walsh was now in an impossible position. Her case against Margaret Whitmore had revealed a massive federal conspiracy, but prosecuting it fully would expose decades of illegal government surveillance and retaliation programs. Judge Harrison turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, given the extraordinary circumstances that have emerged during this trial, I am declaring a mistrial. Mrs. Whitmore will be released pending a full federal investigation into Agent Hartwell's network and the illegal operations conducted under government authority. As Margaret Whitmore was led from the courtroom, not to prison, but to protective custody, she stopped beside Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. I thought I was protecting America. I had no idea I was destroying it. 6 months later, The congressional investigation into Project Purity would reveal that over 300 federal agents had been compromised, leading to the largest reorganization of domestic intelligence agencies since 9/11's. Agent Robert Hartwell would plead guilty to sedition and conspiracy charges, receiving a life sentence in federal prison. But the real victory belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, who had refused to be driven from her homeland. In fighting back, had exposed a cancer growing within the federal government itself. Margaret Whitmore eventually moved to a small apartment across town, spending her remaining years volunteering at immigrant services organizations, trying to atone for the harm she'd unknowingly helped to cause and in Willowbrook estates. The HOA was dissolved entirely, replaced by a simple neighborhood association that focused on block parties instead of property enforcement. Sometimes, the smallest acts of resistance can bring down the largest conspiracies. Sometimes, standing your ground in your own backyard can save democracy itself. The helicopters still fly over the neighborhood, but now they're welcome because the people below have nothing left to hide.